In a quiet park on a sunny afternoon in Atlanta, a 14-year-old black boy sits on a bench reading a book and waiting for his mom. But his peaceful moment shatters when a suspicious woman confronts him, accusing him of loitering and calling the police. Tension rises as officers arrive, questioning the boy as if he were a criminal. Just when the situation seems ready to spiral out of control, a sleek black car pulls up, and out steps Keanu Reeves, the famous actor. What happens next leaves the entire park speechless and sparks a conversation the community will never forget. The late afternoon sun casts golden rays over Riverside Park in Atlanta, Georgia, filtering through the swaying branches of old oak trees. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, where parents sat on benches chatting and watching their kids. Joggers passed by in steady rhythms, earbuds in, lost in their workouts. Birds chirped overhead, adding to the idyllic atmosphere. It was the kind of place where peace felt almost sacred, until it wasn't. On a weathered wooden bench near the fountain, Darius Bennett sat with a book resting on his lap. 14 years old, tall for his age and lean from playing basketball, he was the picture of quiet focus. He wore a plain white t-shirt and slightly faded jeans, his shoes scuffed but clean. His dark, thoughtful eyes scanned the words on the page, but every so often, he'd glance at his phone, checking the time. His mom had promised to pick him up after finishing a late meeting. Darius didn't mind the wait. He liked the park, the open space, the sounds of life swirling around him, the feel of the sun warming his skin. It was one of the few places where he felt truly at ease, where he could think without distractions. But today, something felt different. A tingling sense of unease crept into his chest. He shifted slightly, lifting his eyes from the book. Across the park, a woman sat on a nearby bench. She wasn't watching the children or enjoying the scenery. She was watching him. Margaret Lewis, mid-40s, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, sat rigidly, clutching her handbag. She wore neatly pressed khakis and a button-up shirt, her hair tied back in a tight bun. Her gaze was fixed on Darius, narrowing slightly each time he shifted or looked up from his book. At first, Darius tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just waiting for someone, or maybe he was overthinking things. But as the minutes ticked by, her stares became harder to ignore. She whispered into her phone at one point, glancing at him between sentences. Darius's hands tightened around the edges of his book. He had dealt with looks like this before, people clutching their purses tighter when he walked by, crossing the street to avoid him, or staring just a little too long as if expecting him to do something wrong. He hated it, but he had learned to let it roll off his back. Today, though, was different. Today he was alone. Margaret finally stood, walking toward him with purposeful strides. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of the park like a knife. "What are you doing here?" Darius sat up straighter, bracing himself. "I'm just waiting for my mom," he said, keeping his tone polite and steady, even as his heart began to race. "Waiting for your mom?" she repeated, crossing her arms, her eyes scanning him as though searching for cracks in his story. "I've seen you sitting here for a while now. People like you don't just hang out at parks for no reason." Darius's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what she meant by people like you. "I promise I'm not doing anything wrong," he said. "My mom is on her way to pick me up. She's running a little late." Margaret didn't budge. "Do you have ID? Proof that you're supposed to be here?" "No, ma'am. I don't carry ID. I'm only 14. The words had barely left his mouth before Margaret pulled out her phone and began dialing. "I'm calling the police," she said. Panic flared in Darius's chest. "Wait, what? Why? I didn't do anything." Margaret turned away from him, speaking loudly into her phone. Yes, there's a suspicious individual in Riverside Park. Young black male, about 14 or 15. He's been hanging around and acting strange." Just as Margaret finished her call, sirens wailed in the distance. The tension in the air became suffocating. Moments later, 2 officers arrived, stepping out of their patrol car with wary expressions. One of them, Officer Graham, adjusted his belt as he approached. "What's going on here?" Margaret pointed at Darius. "I caught him loitering. He's been sitting here for too long. I don't think he belongs in this neighborhood." Darius's heart pounded. He had done nothing wrong. He was just waiting for his mom. The officers turned to him. "Son, do you have someone we can call?" Before Darius could respond, the distant roar of a car engine filled the air. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The back door swung open, and out stepped Keanu Reeves, the famous actor. The entire park seemed to pause. Conversations stopped. Even the officers hesitated, their hands hovering near their belts. Keanu's eyes swept over the situation in an instant. He saw the officers. He saw Margaret's smug expression. But most importantly, he saw Darius standing there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, trying to stay composed. Keanu walked forward with the quiet confidence that had made him famous worldwide. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. The officers exchanged glances. "Sir, we received a report about a suspicious individual," one of them said. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Suspicious? A 14-year-old boy reading a book in a park is suspicious now?" Margaret scoffed. "He was loitering." Keanu's expression hardened. "Loitering?" He let out a dry laugh. "So if I sit on that bench over there, am I loitering too?" The officers shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following up on a report." Keanu placed a gentle hand on Darius's shoulder. "This is my friend's son. He was waiting for his mom. That's not a crime, is it?" Silence. Margaret's face paled. I didn't know he was..." Keanu's gaze locked onto her. "You didn't know who he was, but that shouldn't have mattered, should it?" The weight of his words hung in the air. The officers cleared their throats, realizing there was nothing to justify their presence. One of them nodded. "Sorry for the misunderstanding. We'll be on our way." Margaret stood frozen, her face red with embarrassment. Keanu turned to Darius. "You okay?" Darius nodded, though his heart was still racing. "Let's get you home," Keanu said, guiding him toward the car. As they drove away, the entire park remained silent, but the moment would not be forgotten. Because that day, Keanu Reeves had done more than step in. He had reminded everyone watching that a boy sitting on a park bench should never be a crime. "I think he might be up to something." Darius froze, his thoughts racing. Should he run? Should he stay? He knew that running would only make things worse. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted to the bench, even as tears burned behind his eyes. People nearby started to notice. A few whispered. Others pulled out their phones, but no one stepped in. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. 2 police cruisers roared to a stop near the entrance of the park, red and blue lights flashing. Darius's breath hitched as the officers stepped out. The first officer, Reed, was young, tall, and broad-shouldered. His uniform looked crisp, and his eyes immediately locked onto Darius. "Hands where I can see them." Darius stood slowly, raising his hands. "I didn't do anything, sir." "We'll figure that out," Officer Reed replied. "Just stay where you are and don't move." The second officer, Sergeant Daniels, older, calmer, approached more cautiously, scanning the scene. Margaret stepped forward, pointing at Darius. "That's him! He's been sitting here watching people for almost an hour. I think he's casing the place." Officer Reed narrowed his eyes. "Son, we're going to need you to answer a few questions." Darius's voice shook as he tried to explain. "I'm waiting for my mom. She's picking me up soon. I haven't done anything wrong." He stood frozen, his hand still raised, as Officer Reed stepped closer, one hand resting near the holster on his belt. The sharp bark of commands and the flashing red and blue lights made his heart pound in his chest. Around him, the gathering crowd murmured in hushed tones. Some whispered anxiously, while others raised their phones, recording the unfolding scene. Margaret stood a few feet away, arms crossed, lips pressed into a tight line. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, her expression oscillating between righteous indignation and nervous satisfaction. She'd done her part, or so she believed. "Step away from the bench, son," Officer Reed said, his voice firm but not outright hostile. Darius swallowed hard and complied, taking slow, deliberate steps away from the bench and holding his hands out in front of him to show he had nothing to hide. I told you," Darius began, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm just waiting for my mom. She'll be here any minute." "We'll sort that out in a moment," Reed interrupted, taking out a small notepad. "First, we need some identification. You got any ID on you?" "No, sir," Darius replied. "I'm only 14. I don't carry ID." Reed exchanged a look with Sergeant Daniels, who had been quietly observing from a few steps back. Daniels, older and clearly more seasoned, narrowed his eyes but said nothing for the moment. Margaret took a step closer, her heels clicking against the pavement. "He was watching people," she interjected. "I saw him sitting here for over an hour. He wouldn't move, even when I asked him to. He's just loitering, maybe even scouting the area." Her words landed heavily. Darius felt his chest tighten. He looked at Margaret, disbelief etched across his face. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, more to her than to the officers. "I was just sitting there, reading my book." Margaret scoffed. "Reading your book? Don't try to act innocent." Officer Reed's posture stiffened. "Ma'am, we'll handle this," he said, though his voice lacked the authority to fully rein in the situation. He turned back to Darius. "You said your mom is coming to pick you up." "Yes, sir. She'll be here soon." Reed opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Sergeant Daniels stepped forward and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Daniels said evenly. He turned his sharp gaze to Margaret. "Ma'am, did you actually see this young man doing anything suspicious? Or are you just assuming based on how long he's been here?" Margaret faltered, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. "He was just sitting there," she admitted. "But I know the type. He didn't belong." Daniels raised an eyebrow. Didn't belong? He echoed, his voice calm but layered with subtle challenge. This is a public park. Margaret flushed. But before she could respond, the sound of a car pulling up nearby interrupted the exchange. Heads turned as a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop near the edge of the park. The rear door opened, and out stepped Keanu Reeves, the famous actor. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as recognition rippled through the onlookers. "Wait, is that Keanu Reeves?" someone whispered. Margaret's face drained of color. Keanu's boots thudded lightly against the pavement as he strode toward the scene, his gaze locked onto Darius. His expression was a mixture of relief and simmering anger. "Darius," he called, his voice firm. "Mom!" Darius nearly choked out, his hand still raised. Keanu's eyes shifted immediately to the officers, then to Margaret, who suddenly looked very small despite her earlier bravado. "What is going on here?" Keanu demanded, his voice low but carrying undeniable weight. Sergeant Daniels immediately straightened, taking a respectful step back. Officer Reed looked visibly nervous, his earlier confidence evaporating. Keanu's boots clicked sharply against the pavement as he led Darius toward the officers. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire park held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Darius walked beside him, his shoulders still tense, but the warmth of Keanu's protective hand on his back gave him some comfort. He had never been more relieved to see him, yet the humiliation lingered, tightening his chest with every step. Sergeant Daniels, sensing the gravity of the moment, gestured toward a quieter spot near the park's edge, away from the growing crowd. The officers, Keanu, Darius, and Margaret gathered there, leaving the murmuring bystanders to speculate. Margaret followed reluctantly, her arms crossed and her face pale. She clutched her phone as if it could shield her from the consequences of what was about to unfold. Keanu didn't wait for anyone to speak. His voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. "I want answers," he demanded, fixing his sharp gaze on Sergeant Daniels. "I want to know exactly what happened here and why my child was treated like a criminal." Sergeant Daniels cleared his throat. Despite his years of experience, the authority in Keanu Reeves' voice unsettled him. "We received a call about a suspicious individual," he began carefully, glancing at Margaret. "We responded as we are trained to do, following procedure." Keanu's eyebrows shot up. "Does your procedure involve intimidating and questioning a 14-year-old child without any evidence of wrongdoing? Does it involve treating him as a suspect before gathering facts?" Officer Reed shifted uncomfortably beside Daniels but remained silent. "Sir," Daniels replied, his voice more measured, "I can assure you there was no intent to mistreat anyone. Given the call we received, we had to act quickly to assess the situation." Keanu's tone sharpened. "Assess the situation?" His voice carried a quiet intensity that made the air feel heavy. "You had a frightened child and a woman making unfounded accusations. What exactly were you assessing, officer? His skin color? His posture on a bench?" Margaret flinched at Keanu's words, her earlier self-assurance completely shattered. I didn't mean," Margaret stammered. "Didn't mean what?" Keanu turned to her now, his piercing gaze holding her in place. "Didn't mean to assume this boy was dangerous because of how he looks. Didn't mean to call the police instead of simply asking him another question. Or maybe you didn't mean for this to escalate to the point where this child thought his life might be in danger." Margaret's mouth opened and closed as she tried to form a defense, but none came. Instead, her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the ground. Darius finally spoke, his voice quieter but steady. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, addressing Margaret directly. "I was just sitting there, reading and waiting for my mom, that's all." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes wide with guilt. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really thought, You just assumed," Keanu finished for her, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger. "And your assumption could have cost this boy his dignity, or worse." Margaret nodded, her face flushing with shame. "I didn't mean any harm," she repeated weakly. Keanu took a deep breath, visibly working to steady himself. He turned back to Sergeant Daniels. "And what about your officers?" Keanu asked. "Why didn't they investigate properly before escalating this situation? Did they ask him for any explanation? Or did they jump to conclusions too?" Daniels shifted his stance. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Reeves," he said. "This could have been handled better. I take full responsibility for how it unfolded, and I will be filing a report to review our response and determine what training gaps need to be addressed." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "A report is the bare minimum," he said. "I want to see real changes. I want every officer in this precinct to undergo anti-bias training, and I expect follow-ups, not just paperwork that sits in a drawer." Daniels nodded. "I'll make sure it happens," he said firmly. Margaret shifted uneasily, breaking the momentary silence. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I've caused enough trouble already." Keanu's gaze softened just slightly as he looked at her. "No, you won't," he said. "Running away doesn't fix this. I suggest you take a long, hard look at yourself and figure out how to do better. And when we roll out that training program, I expect to see you there too." Margaret swallowed hard and nodded. The crowd, still lingering at a distance, began to disperse, but the weight of what they had witnessed lingered in the air. Darius exhaled slowly, finally allowing himself to relax as Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home," Keanu said gently. But as they turned to leave, Darius paused. "Wait," he said, looking at Margaret. "I hope you really do mean it, that you're sorry." Margaret met his gaze and nodded. "I do," she said quietly. "I really do." With that, Darius walked away, with Keanu, his head held high despite the lingering ache of what had just happened. The ride home was quieter than Darius expected. He sat in the passenger seat of the sleek black SUV, staring out the window as the familiar streets of Atlanta rolled past. The city buzzed with life, cars honking, people walking dogs, families laughing in outdoor cafes. But all Darius could hear was the echo of Officer Reed's sharp commands and Margaret's accusatory tone. Keanu drove with a steady hand, his knuckles tight against the steering wheel, but his silence carried weight. Darius knew he was holding back. For him. Finally, Keanu broke the silence. "Talk to me, Darius." His voice was calm, but Darius could hear the underlying concern. "What's going through your head right now?" Darius hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "I mean, I'm okay now, I guess. I'm just angry, embarrassed." Keanu glanced at him, his expression softening. "You have every right to feel that way. What happened back there was wrong. No one should ever make you feel like you don't belong in your own community." Darius shook his head. "But it keeps happening, Mom, not just to me, to kids like me everywhere. It's like, no matter what we do, people see us as threats first." Keanu exhaled deeply, pulling the car into their driveway. He put it in park but didn't get out right away. Instead, he turned to face Darius. "You're right," he said, "and that's exactly why I have to keep fighting to change it. But it's not just my fight, Darius. It's yours too. Today you stood up for yourself. You kept your cool even when it wasn't fair. That matters." Darius looked down at his hands. It didn't feel like it mattered. "It did," Keanu insisted, "and it still does. But this doesn't end here. Tomorrow we're going to make sure this situation isn't swept under the rug. I'll meet with the chief of police and the city council. I want that training program implemented immediately, and I want updates on how it's going." Darius nodded slowly, absorbing his words, but part of him still felt uneasy. "What about Margaret?" he asked. "She said she was sorry, but what if she didn't mean it?" Keanu's eyes softened. "People don't change overnight, Darius. But sometimes, moments like today force them to reflect. Whether or not she meant it, she has to sit with what she did. And we're going to hold her accountable to make sure she learns from this." Darius nodded, but the ache in his chest lingered. He knew Keanu would fight for change. He always did. But he couldn't help wondering how many other kids like him wouldn't have someone powerful to step in when it counted. The next morning, Keanu stood in his office, flipping through a thick folder of reports and notes. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Keanu Reeves had already called an emergency meeting with the police chief and several city officials. Darius sat on a couch by the window, pretending to scroll through his phone, but glancing up nervously every few seconds. "Mom," he finally asked, "are you nervous?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Not nervous, just focused." Before he could say more, a knock sounded at the door, and his assistant poked her head in. "They're ready for you, Mr. Reeves." Keanu stood, straightening his blazer. "Let's do this." Darius stayed behind as Keanu walked out, but he couldn't sit still. After a few minutes, he decided to wander down to the conference room where the meeting was taking place. He stood just outside the door, listening. Inside, Keanu's voice carried clearly. "I want immediate action," he said firmly, "not just promises. This incident highlighted cracks in our system that we can no longer ignore." The police chief cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves, I understand your frustration, but change takes time. Implementing new training programs, especially ones focused on anti-bias education, requires resources and coordination." "Then find them," Keanu snapped, "because time is a luxury we can't afford. How many more kids like Darius have to face this kind of humiliation, or worse, before we act?" There was a beat of silence. Then Sergeant Daniels' voice cut in. "I think Mr. Reeves is right," his tone steady. "We need to move quickly. What happened yesterday wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a symptom of a much larger issue. If we don't address it now, we'll be back here again, facing something even worse." Darius's heart lifted slightly at Daniels' words. He hadn't expected the officer to take their side so strongly. "Thank you, Sergeant Daniels," Keanu said. "Now let's talk about next steps." The rest of the conversation was muffled as Darius stepped back from the door. For the first time since the incident, He felt something other than anger or shame. He felt hope. That evening, Keanu sat with Darius at the kitchen table, reviewing notes from the meeting. "So, it's really happening?" Darius asked. Keanu smiled. "It is. The program starts next month. And Margaret? What about her? She'll be there for the training." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Volunteered or was told to?" Keanu laughed softly. "Maybe a little of both, but the important thing is she's taking the first step, and so are we." Darius nodded, leaning back in his chair. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "No," Keanu agreed, "but it's a start." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling around them. Darius knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced something like this, but for now, he felt stronger, knowing his voice had been heard, and that change, even if slow, was coming. The following week, Riverside Park seemed quieter than usual. Darius stood near the same bench where the incident had unfolded, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He glanced around, half expecting someone to stare or whisper. But instead, he saw smiles and nods from a few familiar faces, people who had witnessed what had happened. A woman jogging past slowed down and gave him an encouraging smile. "Stay strong, young man," she said before continuing her run. Darius exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure how to feel about the attention. Part of him appreciated the support, but another part of him wished none of it had ever happened. He wished he could go back to being just another kid sitting in the park, invisible and unbothered. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Turning, he saw Margaret approaching. She wasn't as put together as before. Her hair looked hastily tied back, and her face carried the faint shadows of sleepless nights. She hesitated when she saw him, then took a few more steps forward. "Darius," she began, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Darius straightened, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Lewis," she winced slightly at the formality but pressed on. "I wanted to see you in person. I know I already apologized, but words aren't enough. I was wrong about everything." Darius didn't say anything. He wanted to believe her, but he wasn't sure if he could trust a change of heart. Margaret swallowed, looking down at her hands. "I've been attending the anti-bias training your mom—" She stopped, correcting herself. "Your family set up, and it's been eye-opening. I didn't realize how much I was carrying. Fear, assumptions, things I thought were harmless, but they weren't harmless. What I did to you wasn't harmless." She looked up, her eyes shining. "I can't change what happened, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again, to you or anyone else." Darius studied her for a moment before speaking. "How?" Margaret's hands fidgeted, but she stood firm. "I started volunteering at the youth center near here. They need help with tutoring, and I thought maybe I could do some good there. Your dad also asked me to share my story during the trainings, to explain what I did and why it was wrong." Darius nodded slowly. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but forgiveness wasn't something he could offer immediately. "I'm glad you're trying," he said at last, "but it's going to take time, for me, and probably for you too." Margaret gave him a small, grateful smile. "I understand." As she walked away, Darius felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was a step towards something better. Back at City Hall, Keanu Reeves stood before a packed room. Community leaders, police officers, and concerned citizens filled every seat. The quiet buzz of conversation died down as Keanu stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice strong and steady. "What happened last week at Riverside Park was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper issue that has been ignored for far too long." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But today, we're taking action. The anti-bias training program we've implemented isn't just about the police force. It's about our entire community. We're partnering with schools, businesses, and organizations to ensure that everyone, young and old, understands how bias works and how to confront it." The crowd broke into quiet applause, but Keanu wasn't done. "Change isn't easy," he continued. "It takes effort, education, and accountability, but it's worth it, because no one should feel unsafe in their own neighborhood, and no child should be treated like a threat simply for existing." He glanced at Darius, who sat near the front. "My son reminded me of something important that day. Progress doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we speak out, even when it's uncomfortable." Weeks passed, and the anti-bias program began to take shape. Officers attended training sessions, sharing personal stories and discussing how to rebuild trust with the community. Schools introduced lessons on empathy and inclusion, with Darius even joining a panel to talk about his experience. And Margaret? She became a regular volunteer at the youth center, slowly building connections with the same community she once viewed with suspicion. Darius noticed her efforts, and over time, their encounters at the park grew less awkward. One afternoon, as she handed out art supplies to a group of kids, Darius walked by. "Hi, Mrs. Lewis," he greeted. Margaret looked up and smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Hi, Darius." It wasn't friendship, but it was progress. One evening, as Darius and Keanu Reeves sat on their porch, they watched the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and deep violet, a quiet contrast to the storm of emotions that had consumed the past few weeks. Darius exhaled, resting his arms on the porch railing. "Do you think it's really going to work?" he asked, his voice quiet. "The training, the programs, all of it." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "I think it's a start, and sometimes that's enough to make a difference." Darius leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself to relax. He let the weight of everything settle, let the tension he'd been carrying for days ease, even just a little. "You know," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "I thought parks were supposed to be peaceful." Keanu laughed softly, the sound warm in the cool evening air. "They still can be," he said. "And maybe now, because of what happened, they'll be even safer for everyone." Darius didn't respond right away. He let the words settle, let himself believe in the possibility. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried more certainty than it had in days. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so." What happened at that park wasn't just an isolated moment. It was a reminder that change starts with speaking up. Darius stood his ground, Keanu Reeves took action, and together they proved that progress is possible. But this story isn't just about them, it's about all of us. If we want a better world, we have to be willing to challenge assumptions, push for change, and stand up for what's right. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are so many more stories that need to be told, and I'd love for you to be part of this journey. See you in the next one.